Note by the late Mr. Allan Quatermain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. She and Allan by H. Rider Haggard. Note by the late Mr. Allan Quatermain. My friend, into whose hands I hope that all these manuscripts of mine will pass one day, of this one I have something to say to you. A long while ago I jotted down it in the history of the events that it details with more or less completeness. This I did for my own satisfaction. You will have noted how memory fails us when we advance in years. We recollect with an almost painful exactitude what we experienced and saw in our youth, but the happenings of our middle life slip away from us or become blurred, like a stretch of low-lying landscape overflowed by grey and nebulous mist. Far off the sun still seems to shine upon the plains and hills of adolescence and early manhood. As yet it shines about us in the fleeting hours of our age. That ground on which we stand today, but the valley between is filled with fog. Yes, even its prominences, which symbolize the more startling events of that past, often are lost in this confusing fog. It was an appreciation of these truths which led me to set down the following details, though of course much is omitted, of my brief intercourse with the strange and splendid creature whom I knew under the name of Ayesha, or Hiya, or She Who Commands, not indeed with any view to their publication, but before I forgot them, that, if I wished to do so, I might re-pursue them in the evening of old age to which I hoped to attain. Indeed, at the time the last thing I intended was that they should be given to the world, even after my own death, because they, or many of them, are so unusual that I feared lest they should cause smiles and in a way cast a slur upon my memory and truthfulness. Also, as you will read, as to this matter I made a promise, and I have always tried to keep my promises and to guard the secrets of others. For these reasons I proposed, in case I neglected or forgot to destroy them myself, to leave a direction that this should be done by my executors. Further, I have been careful to make no allusion whatever to them, either in casual conversation or in anything else that I may have written, my desire being that this page of my life should be kept quite private, something known only to myself. Therefore, too, I never so much as hinted of them to any one, not even to yourself, to whom I have told so much. Well, I recorded the main facts concerning this expedition and its issues, simply and with as much exactness as I could, and laid them aside. I do not say that I never thought of them again, since amongst them were some which, together with the problems they suggested, proved to be of an unforgettable nature. Also, whenever any of Ayesha's sayings or stories which are not preserved in these pages came back to me, as has happened from time to time, I jotted them down and put them away with this manuscript. Thus, among these notes you will find a history of the city of Kôr as she told it to me, which I have omitted here. Still, many of these remarkable events did more or less fade from my mind, as the image does from an unfixed photograph, till only their outlines remained, faint if distinguishable. To tell the truth, I was rather ashamed of the whole story in which I cut so poor a figure. On reflection it was obvious to me, although honesty had compelled me to set out all that is essential exactly as it occurred, adding nothing and taking nothing away, that I had been the victim of very gross deceit. This strange woman, whom I had met in the ruins of a place called Kôr, without any doubt had thrown a glamour over my senses and at the moment almost caused me to believe much that is quite unbelievable. For instance, she had told me ridiculous stories as to interviews between herself and certain heathen goddesses, though it is true that, almost with her next breath, these she qualified or contradicted. Also, she had suggested that her life had been prolonged far beyond our mortal span, for hundreds and hundreds of years, indeed, which as Euclid says is absurd, and had pretended to supernatural powers, which is still more absurd. Moreover, by a clever use of some hypnotic or mesmeric power, she had feigned to transport me to some place beyond the earth and in the halls of Hades to show me what is veiled from the eyes of man. And not only me, but the savage warrior Umslopogaas, commonly called Umslopogaas of the Axe, who with Hans, a Hottentot, was my companion upon that adventure. There were like things equally incredible, such as her appearance when all seemed lost in the battle with the troll-like Rezu. To omit these, the sum of it was that I had been shamefully duped, and if anyone finds himself in that position, as most people have at one time or another in their lives, wisdom suggests that he had better keep the circumstances to himself. Well, so the matter stood, or rather lay in the recesses of my mind, and in the cupboard where I hid my papers, when one evening someone, as a matter of fact it was Captain Good, an individual of romantic tendencies who is fond, sometimes I think too fond, of fiction, brought a book to this house which he insisted over and over again really I must pursue. Ascertaining that it was a novel, I declined, for tell the truth I am not fond of romance in any shape, being a person who has found the hard facts of life of sufficient interest as they stand. Reading, I admit I like, but in this matter, as in everything else, my range is limited. I study the Bible, especially the Old Testament, both because of its sacred lessons and of the majesty of the language of its inspired translators, whereof that of Asha, which I render so poorly from her flowing and melodious Arabic, reminded me. For poetry I turn to Shakespeare, and at the other end of the scale to the Ingoldsby Legends, many of which I know almost by heart, while for current affairs I content myself with the newspapers. For the rest I pursue anything to do with ancient Egypt that I happen to come across, because this land and its history have a queer fascination for me, that perhaps has its roots in occurrences or dreams, of which this is not the place to speak. Lastly, now and again, I read one of the Latin or Greek authors in translation, since I regret to say that my lack of education does not enable me to do so in the original. But for modern fiction I have no taste, although from time to time I sample it in a railway train, and occasionally am amused by such excursions into the poetic and unreal. So it came about that the more Good bothered me to read this particular romance, the more I determined that I would do nothing of the sort. Being a persistent person, however, when he went away about 10 o'clock at night, he deposited it by my side, under my nose indeed, so that it might not be overlooked. Thus it came about that I could not help seeing some Egyptian hieroglyphics in an oval on the cover, also the title, and underneath it your own name, my friend, all of which excited my curiosity, especially the title, which was brief and enigmatic, consisting indeed of one word, She. I took up the work, and on opening it, the first thing my eye fell upon was a picture of a veiled woman, the sight of which made my heart stand still. So painfully did it remind me of a certain veiled woman who once it had been my fortune to meet. Glancing from it to the printed page, one word seemed to leap at me. It was Kôr. Now of veiled women there are plenty in the world, but were there also two Kôrs? Then I turned to the beginning and began to read. This happened in the autumn, when the sun does not rise till about 6, but it was broad daylight before I ceased from reading, or rather rushing through that book. Oh, what was I to make of it? For here in its pages, to say nothing of old Billali, who by the way lied, probably to order, when he told Mr. Holly that no white man had visited his country for many generations, and those gloomy, man-eating Amahagger scoundrels. Once again I found myself face to face with she who commands, now rendered as she who must be obeyed, which means much the same thing, in her case at least. Yes, with Ayesha the lovely, the mystic, the changeful, and the imperious. Moreover, the history filled up many gaps in my own limited experiences of that enigmatical being who was half divine, though I think rather wicked or at any rate unmoral in her way, and yet all woman. It is true that I showed her in lights very different from and higher than those in which she had presented herself to me, yet the substratum of her character was the same, or rather of her characters, for of these she seemed to have several in a single body, being, as she said of herself to me, not one, but many, and not here, but everywhere. Further, I found the story of Kallikrates, which I had set down as a mere falsehood invented for my bewilderment, expanded and explained, or rather not explained, since perhaps that she might deceive me, to me she had spoken of this murdered Kallikrates without enthusiasm, as a handsome person to whom because of an indiscretion of her youth she was bound by destiny and whose return, somewhat to her sorrow, she must wait. At least she did so at first, though in the end, when she bared her heart at the moment of our farewell, she vowed she loved him only, and was appointed to him by a divine decree. Also I found other things of which I knew nothing, such as the fire of life with its fatal gift of indefinite existence, although I remember that like the giant Rezu whom Umslopogaas defeated, she did talk of a cup of life, of which she had drunk, that might have been offered to my lips, had I been politic, bowed the knee and shown more faith in her and her supernatural pretensions. Lastly, I saw the story of her end, and as I read it I wept. Yes, I confess I wept, although I feel sure that she will return again. Now I understood why she had quailed and even seemed to shrivel when, in my last interview with her, stung beyond endurance by her witcheries and sarcasms, I had suggested that even for her with all her powers, fate might reserve one of its shrewdest blows. Some prescience had told her that if the words seemed random, truth spoke through my lips, although, and this was the worst of it, she did not know what weapon would deal the stroke, or when and where it was doomed to fall. I was amazed, I was overcome, but as I closed that book I made up my mind first that I would continue to preserve absolute silence as to Ayesha and my dealings with her, as, during my life, I was bound by oath to do, and secondly that I would not cause my manuscript to be destroyed. I did not feel that I had any right to do so in view of what already had been published to the world. There let it lie, to appear one day, or not to appear, as might be fated. Meanwhile my lips were sealed. I would give Good back his book without comment and buy another copy. One more word. It is clear that I did not touch more than the fringe of the real Ayesha. In 1,000 ways she bewitched and deceived me so that I never plumbed her nature's depths. Perhaps this was my own fault, because from the first I shewed a lack of faith in her, and she wished to pay me back in her own fashion. Or perhaps she had other private reasons for her secrecy. Certainly the character she discovered to me differed in many ways from that which she revealed to Mr. Holly and to Leo Vincey or Callicrates, whom it seems once she slew in her jealousy and rage. She told me as much as she thought fit that I should know, and no more. Allan Quatermain, The Grange, Yorkshire. End of note by the late Mr. Allan Quatermain, from She and Allan by H. Rider Haggard. Read by Lars Rolander.